Hello, and welcome to CRO Insights, How CROs Win, the podcast that uncovers the key markers of successful revenue leadership, brought to you by the CRO Collective in partnership with the Revenue Operations Alliance. In each episode, we'll explore the CRO career path, the major challenges facing CROs today, and discover strategies for building aligned revenue engines that scale your company's growth. Welcome to the CRO Insights podcast, How CROs Win, with a podcast that uncovers key markers of successful revenue leadership. The podcast is brought to you by the CRO Collective in partnership with the Revenue Operations Alliance. And today I'm real excited to bring you a great guest, Joshua Trott, whom I met at the CRO Summit, the Chief Revenue Officer Summit, and just extremely like-minded. Immediately, we had a really long conversation, and I was like, okay, this will be a great person to speak to. So Joshua, thank you so much for being here today.
Really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, great. So welcome, and really appreciate you being here. I know that we had a chance to chat a bit at the CRO Summit, which, by the way, you're going to be going to the one in Chicago? Or
not this time around. No, I've got a more time I'm spending with my kids here, so less travel right now.
Great. Well, appreciate you being here. And, as you and I had talked offline, we share very similar viewpoints on not just the CRO role, which we'll get into in more detail, but just, the business in general, what's been happening in the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So maybe just to start things out, why don't you give us a little background on yourself and where you're at and your roles and your CRO ascension, as we call it,
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to keep it quick because it's certainly not the probably traditional path, but I think that's what we'll get into maybe a little bit later on this role. So I'm actually not a kind of pure play sales and marketing guy. My career actually started in strategy and operations. And so it was much more focused on how you build kind of like enduring, lasting companies, how you think about not just go to market, but like competitive advantage and how you're actually building sustainable strategies to enable your success. And when you put it that way, it actually, I believe, sounds a lot like the scope of what a CRO ultimately owns in the end. But 15 years ago, this role didn't really exist as I understand it, right? And so I worked in strategy consulting for a period of time. I was a VP at a publicly traded company, like really driving energy transition. So kind of completely outside the realm of sales, and really started to get my first experience in like the sales role as I started to get more and more customer facing, both in like the consulting side as I became more senior. And then as I moved into new roles at new companies where I had more like GM kind of total P&L ownership experience. And I think that like experience, especially pre kind of my Workrise time, was really where I started to cement some of that sales, kind of like traditional sales capabilities, really thinking about how you build and manage quotas, how you think about sales incentives, but the unification of like the sales with the rest of the business and that total P&L ownership, I think is really where I started to understand the criticality of like the orchestra that you're conducting when you're kind of overseeing the totality of go-to-market teams. And so when I moved to Workrise, I actually joined as a VP of sales. So I was just overseeing sales across 7 business units at that time. So like 7 different businesses that we had acquired. And over my time there, worked to consolidate that and ultimately was ascended to the CRO role where I had sales, marketing, revenue ops, sales operations, and strategy. So like kind of the whole gambit of it. And then I've just recently actually left that company. And so I'm kind of pursuing some individual endeavors at this time and kind of thinking about going back to my consultative roots and helping companies that way. But it's been really interesting to watch the arc of that role. And I will be very honest, when it was given to me, I didn't actually even understand what it was. I was like, oh, isn't this more of like a COO role than a CRO role? And I think that confusion actually was quite insightful to how we need to more clearly define the expectations and how companies think about what a CRO is meant to do and how you enable the success of that role, right? And get the most out of it. So,
yeah, well, sure. I agree with that. I certainly do.
Yeah.
There is just a strange ambiguity around the CRO role in the marketplace. It's almost like I call it like tofu, like you can make it taste like anything. And that's not good. It needs to be one flavor. And I think that would solve, frankly, a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sort of feed my theories on this. I don't think it's pertinent. I'd rather hear yours. So why do you think that is? Why that happened, and what's the sort of pervasive reason why the CRO role is so ambiguous?
And I've heard you speak to this a little bit as well. And I think that's why we're talking. It's like I think what ends up happening is one, groupthink. So if everyone's doing it, I need to do it too. And I mean that more from like the company perspective, where it's like if there is a pressure to have a quote unquote like revenue leader who you can kind of put the big target on, right? And it's one of those things where you're going to go find some great person who's got some demonstrated growth experience, can speak to great numbers, and they're going to bring that to me, and that's going to be like success, right? And I think that plus a lot of, I think the companies that like I've consulted with in the past and ones that I even talk to now, you see a lot of folks that maybe don't start from like a sales go-to-market perspective. And so it's like the opportunity to continue to educate as like you're thinking about hiring and how you think about kind of like JDs and getting the right like insights as you're building that organization to say, are we mature enough to have that? And so I think what you end up with is a bunch of a very generic role title that has a myriad of scopes that are included in it, right? And that's kind of problematic. When you talk about the CEO or the CTO or the CFO, the scope is usually pretty consistent and well-defined, yep, and you can kind of transfer. But if you're like in the job market and one role is pure play sales and you only own the sales team and another one is like the full suite, but they're both CROs, I would argue the person you're hiring for those roles are typically quite different, right? And yep, maybe their background and experience is not going to be like for like, and nor are you going to get success. And so that's kind of my hypothesis there, is that I think there's just maybe an opportunity, given the role is so new, that it just needs to be better clearly defined and better understood. And I know that's a lot of what you try to work on, is helping to evangelize that, which I think is great.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that there is a interesting sort of thing that happened. I think, frankly, the internet, the creation of the internet changed profoundly the way businesses are looked at and viewed, for reasons that some are evidently apparent, some are a little bit more nefariously sort of like just obtuse, like one is the obvious, which is, okay, so now we have this sort of multi-platform channel. We can distribute immediately. We can get eyeballs and all the other things that go with the internet. It kind of takes localization and expands it out to the globe, all the stuff that was obvious. But the real things about that made the internet interesting was measurement and attribution, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh boy, we can prove things, right? Okay, fine. We could prove whatever we want. We could maybe make things sticky and create cookies and likes and all the other, weird metrics that we use to measure investments and such. And that resulted in a whole new paradigm. And it created SaaS business, which was ostensibly the ability to push multiple people, one thing, and have them pay for it immediately and build a massive business quickly. And it was really cool. A lot of people made like literally trillions of dollars collectively at doing this. And it created an exuberance that I think upended businesses, mainly because the SaaS business it was probably appropriate for that business for a period of time because it made money and it was fine. It kind of worked within its own ecosystem. And I think there was a degree of everyone was happy. Customers got really cool things and people made a lot of money and, everyone was sort of blah, 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 blah. But it started breaking down. I think two things happened was that customers eventually started realizing that, these are not sustainable businesses. The customer is really not really very important to these businesses. It's more about acquisition of perspective. I'm just someone who you want to acquire, is someone you want to keep. And so that became opportunities for a couple of companies. I think namely probably Apple and Amazon are the two that probably thought about the customer a little bit more than most people did. And so they won that game. But I think what happened was because customer acquisition, or let's call it sales, to be more blunt, became the key driver of these businesses. The sales role became so important that the CRO naturally gravitated to become the person to manage that because it was the most vital thing in this model. But everyone knows that that's sort of like a losing game because, it doesn't work long term. It was eventually going to cannibalize itself. And that's what's happened. And I think what's happened as a result is now the go-to-market boom, which I think is it's a culture to itself, maybe even a cult unto itself to some degree. Because I believe functionally go-to-market makes sense. I don't like the language of it, but that's fine. That's what we've given it. I think it's too late. The cat's out of the bag on that, but that's fine. So let's say we agree that go-to-market is the way to go forward, which is a ubiquitous way of looking across the customer life cycle and customer journey as a way to go sell your business or build your business. You need someone to coordinate that. You need someone who oversees that. And it can't be a CEO, at least not forever. Probably maybe the first $10 million or so, that probably makes sense. But after a while, that role needs to be handed over to someone who has the competency to look across all that stuff. And that's a much different person than someone who's just going to go acquire customers for you every day. And I don't think that companies really made the jump there. I think they're sort of still trying to square that. And I think that we're in this, I believe, this transition period between this growth at all costs sort of thing and this new sort of customer centricity, which I think is going to be more permanent, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
That now that model, the new CRO, the competency profile of that person is much different. It's much more operational, much more strategic, much less about just kind of going out there and stabbing the marketplace and bringing back pelts every day. It's really someone who really is thinking about growth in a way that's much more, I think, longer term. And that also kills the idea of, investing in businesses that we can flip in 2 years. This is not the real estate business. I'm not going to build a house, paint the walls, and then get somebody to buy it. Just businesses can't be really sustainable that way. Some can, but not really. And so, and then the last part of this little diatribe is the way the SaaS business affected and influenced other businesses, right? People looked at that business like, look how successful those guys are. Maybe we can repeat that and do it ourselves. But no, you sell hardware, or you're a servicing, or you're a roofing company. You're not necessarily, some degree, yes. But that repeatability is not there. So some of the modalities of those companies, the business model is not applicable to those. But there are ways you can borrow from it. And I think some of it, frankly, is the CRO role became still tagged as this sales leader thing. And so, I think you and I are both in the middle of this thing. I believe that the people whom recognize this on both the founder side and on the incoming CRO side have a massive opportunity to become people who are really important to build a new wave of the way markets are being built. But so my thoughts are like, what do you think then, assuming you agree with everything I just said? I don't know. What do you think the competencies are? Like, what's the right person? Who do you look for now? So you're a founder, you're going to run a company, you agree with us. You're like, all right, so now what do I do? What do you think that person should be looking for?
So I think the key, and this goes back to my consulting days, which I attribute a ton of like the success I've had in my life, has been down to kind of a more scientific method approach to problem solving. Mm-hmm. And that's to say, you've talked about SaaS there for a while. People who are just going to bring the playbook that they ran from the last place, and like that's their kind of like credibility is like, well, I've done it over here. If it is, there's not plasticity or agility in their ability to think about, like, that's a framework, one of many that can be applied. But I need data, and I need to be able to structure experiments quickly, that like I can read data quickly and then start to invest my dollars, which are getting more and more limited, to figure out like what the winning formula is over here. That ability to transplant that success and have agility, to me, is actually the most critical aspect of this role, because you can kind of skin a cat in multiple ways, right? At the end of the day, I think what you're seeing even with SaaS, like, people are questioning that entire,
no doubt they are,
pricing model because of the rise of AI. It's like, do seats licenses make sense? Like, if that's all you know how to do, it's evolve or die, right? And so when I think about this role, and you're managing a lot of complexity, right? Each role, I've led CS individually, I've led sales individually. Marketing is probably my kind of least strength. Understanding like where you're strong, where you need to supplement, and then being able to set up systems that enable those leaders of those individual functions to run those experiments so you can get good data. Like, that to me is like the future, right? Like, you have to be able to do that, because you're just operating with, like, quite frankly, it's like a more hostile purchasing environment, right? And so like, if you're not great and your product isn't awesome and you can't figure out how to like think about an evolution in your approach to how you try to go to market, I just don't see you succeeding in that role. And I think it doubles down to the point that you were talking about around like, there's no more just quick churn and burn, right? Like, if you're going to sell something and oversell it and you're overpromising and that thing under delivers, people will speak with their wallets and their checkbooks. And like, you need to be able to build long-term real value that they want to keep coming back. And that means the company is going to evolve. The product will have to evolve at an incredible rate. And how you act as the voice of that customer to your internal company, and really can speak to, just like you would expect like product in your organization to have a voice there, you're really talking about like the more emotional aspect of this, of when they have to sign, right? And like, that's when the truth comes out. And like, you have to be able to do that. So I think, to summarize, it's like really two key things. It's like, do you have the strategic agility to understand that the playbook and framework you used before may not work here, and like the humility to accept that and challenge those assumptions, is one. And then your ability to convey and capture, build trust, and then convey and capture that voice to bring inside. Like, those two to me are what will make enduring CROs, so that your average duration isn't 18 months, but you get to be in a role for 3, 4, 5 years, right? Which is not the norm, but ideally it should be. It's an incredible turnover rate.
It should be. Yeah, I agree with you. I think the problem solving thing is a really critical thing. I think knowing that you're sort of reinventing the wheel every time you take a new one of these roles, you have to think that way. It's not like you can walk in with some blueprint. And I sort of maybe uh, modify that a bit in that
Hmm.
I think that there's a right way to make a general approach, right? There's like sort of like what you do first, what you do second sort of thing. It's what you encounter is going to be different. So you need to know how to respond to it, right? It's not going to be like this
Correct.
machine that you can just go and say, okay, I know how to do this. I think like you look at it like someone who fixes boilers or someone who fixes certain machines. They certainly can go and bring all the tools and they know exactly what tools are going to work and they can fix the
Yeah.
same thing every time. I mean, there might be different things, but it's all known. Oh, I know what that is. I know what that is. I'll fix that. This is like, oh boy, okay, so this situation is unique, but you have a set of principles that you can apply to solving that, and you have the ability to know how those principles are flexible enough to be applied to that situation. And you're right, you have to sort of start over. And this also is a problem with the way that the job is interviewed, right? So, this is a crazy thing. So, people sort of do want that. They want some boilerplate system. They can go, well, what are you going to bring me? How are you going to solve my problem? And, they're
Yeah.
not thinking like, well, I need someone that can know how to do that, not someone who's going to come in with a solution because I don't know, no one really knows what it is. You have to sort of figure it out. And so what happens is, and this is the myopia I see with CROs when they're getting a job, is they're sort of being asked, well, tell me about your last CRO role. How did you solve that problem? But they're not listening to it like, oh, I want to hear how this person thinks. It's more like, I want to know what you did because I want you to do that here.
Correct.
And it may not be applicable. So that person suddenly seems like not desirable when in fact you miss the opportunity to bring in someone who may in fact know how to do that in any environment. And so I see the issue is, someone's going for a chief revenue officer role, the way they're being questioned, they can tell that someone has this sort of idea of the kind of person they want, and they want to find that match, and they can't find it. It's not doesn't work that
Yeah.
way. So what we're doing a lot also is working with people looking for CROs to understand how to sort of communicate that better, so that there's a better understanding of how you close that gap, because you're dealing
Hmm.
with weirdly, I think maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people will be hiring strategic CROs enough that there'll be a better playbook for how to find one. But that's not the case right now. You're up
Yep.
against organizations that don't know how to hire you, probably don't know how to support you. They have a good understanding of what you're supposed to do, but they don't know what you need to do it. And so they're sort of lost. And um, so my question then on the other side is, based on that, is, okay, you're an inbound CRO. How do you evaluate the marketplace to determine the kind of job that you should take to know that it's an environment where you can succeed?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes through like your engagement with like the process and like as you meet the executive team, what are they challenging you on, right? And like where are they seeming to like focus? And so I place like a lot of value in those conversations. And what I mean by that, if all of the questions are just hyper focused on like how do you just drive hyper growth, and like that's the only thing they want to talk about, and they want to hear about just like, okay, the last company you did X and it went from X to Y, like how did like why did that work there? To me, it is not indicating that they have like the right kind of like one first team mentality of like understanding what drives hyper growth in companies. And this gets into the false signal, right? Like you could have a tremendous amount of false signal in both directions of like this CRO is the attribution of like success to the company's growth is all because this guy or girl is a genius, but maybe the product market fit was just unquestionable and there was
Yeah,
like no
exactly.
competition.
They
And
were
so,
they were in the right place and the right job at the right product, and it could be a
and
false signal
you,
for
yeah.
sure.
And
Yes.
so like and just equally as much as like you could have a great person who had a, like didn't have those attributes, the thing has muted growth, but like, and I'm a soccer fan. It's like you watch like Jose Mourinho talk about his time at Man United, and he's like, that was the greatest accomplishment of my career, and he won second place, and the guy won Champions Leagues and leagues, and they were like, how could that be? He was speaking to the fact of like the parts that I was working with were extremely challenged, and this was my greatest managerial feat. There's like, I think that's a challenge that the CRO can also face, where it's like the company going in looks amazing on paper. They've got all this notoriety, the right investor set, but until you can like understand what do they want out of this role? Do they want someone who's like a systems thinker? Because that's ultimately, I think, a key criteria to being a
Yeah,
CRO. It's
critical.
not just a pure salesperson. How do you think about like structure? How do you think about process? What's the role? How do you balance speed versus quality and like driving that growth, but doing it with an eye to the bottom line? Like those types of questions that I see them coming to me, like if they're caring about the totality of the system, then they're really thinking, understanding the role, I think, of what the CRO is, which is to work in concert with that executive team and figure out how you drive sustainable, profitable growth with low churn, increasing and
Yep.
improving the unit economics, all of the things you would expect. But a lot of the times, I think you see it all be about like, what is your experience running this sales playbook, and like, what have been your numbers? What did you go from X to Y? Did you go from 50 to 100? How did
Yep.
you do that? Right.
Yep.
And it's those questions I think are superficial and reveal how they're thinking about what they're
Like
going to drive you
100%.
on in the role, right? And then what happens at the board level, right? Which it becomes
100%.
your fault and your problem.
Yep. Yep. I mean, these are all the signals I teach my clients how to listen for. And here's the thing, you brought something up that's interesting, sort of weird little, this might not make sense, but indulge me. So this idea of the false signal thing. So, you probably saw the movie Rain Man. Everyone saw the movie Rain Man,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, it's really cool how this, Raymond character, sort of starts to, um, display all of his savant like skills, right? Like he's able to identify how many toothpicks are in the thing immediately. And his brother is starting to like observe this stuff and say, wow, like I could see that he's got this brilliance about him. And so he takes him to Vegas, right, to utilize these skills to win a lot of money. And it's a fascinating thing. It's not really, no one ever really spoke about this before. But he goes to the poker tables, and you could tell how Raymond's skills are applicable to that because he's looking at probabilities, and he's able to count the cards because he can know how many are in there. His brain works that way. And then he walks over to the roulette table where those principles don't apply, and he fucks up everything. He can't get it right, and he can't figure out why because he didn't really understand the skill set that he was working with. And what this is the false signal is someone comes into your company and does a really good job, or you hear someone did something once. And so you think that means that they could do it again all the time. But it was the situation. It was a lot of things that went into that don't necessarily mean that that's a repetitive skill. Plus, it's easy to get false signals of someone who had success somewhere and they get all this accolades, and there's a perception in the marketplace, this person's really, really, really smart. But it just happened to be this one situation where they were able to succeed in that it doesn't translate over to other situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think on the other side of it too is you need to be able to, on one side, show how your skill sets at this particular circumstance are transferable to your circumstance. And two is if I'm evaluating somebody, I need to know whether or not they are transferable to my circumstance. And I don't think people are talking about this fun of, this four-dimensional chess game that you sort of have to play with this role because it's not the same. And until that changes, I think we're going to still see a lot of miscalculations in the way the roles. And I think the CRO, the incoming CRO, has to be the more responsible party for making sure that doesn't happen. Because if you count on the company interviewing you, they're not going to get that right too often. They're not.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And not to bring it back to this, but I think that's where like using kind of the hypothesis driven approach to evaluating the opportunity in the company, just like you would to figure out then what the playbook is that's going to work for that company. That's why that that framework and paradigm is so powerful, right? Because like if you can take a position on, well, I think this is what the company wants out of this role. Let me structure my then questions to go dive into like confirmation or or an invalidation of that. Like then you're going to get smart, and you're going to, I believe, be a more effective interviewer as you're engaging, right? And I think the company then also learns because they're like, oh, this person is asking very smart, insightful questions. I haven't thought about, am I thinking about this the right way, right? And I think that's where you can start to really differentiate yourself as a candidate because they're like, oh,
no question.
I thought I wanted X, but I think I actually want Y. And if he figured this out already, just doing this, like imagine what he could do with our resourcing, right? Like behind him.
Spot on. This is exactly my whole process. And you just thank you. It's like I'm basically telling my clients, you have to become the best candidate because you've actually changed the way that they think about the role.
Mm-hmm.
You have to challenge their perceptions so that they actually start thinking about it differently, and you become the person whom influence their thinking on how this is activated. And it's almost like it's the difference between saying, I have a system and I know how to build systems.
Yeah.
Because if they're looking for a system, I wouldn't work for these people because they're not going to find it. They have to find someone who knows how to build systems. That's the person I'm looking for. And if they don't really get that, you're probably screwed,
And I think that's what, quite frankly, makes this role very specifically in the C-suite, very hard. It's just a very complex role because, and I say this through the lens of if you think about the roles and responsibilities. So I used to, when I was a consultant, I focused on org design and building like high performing teams. So you thought about roles and responsibilities, governance, decision making rights, all of those things. This one, when you think about the functions that roll up into it, for every other one, there's a general, in my view, similarity across the types of functions that you're going to find that live within the role, like house of the CFO and the CTO. There's overseeing two or three of these organizations that roll up there. It's going to be a lot of the same. Like you're leveraging a lot of the same core competencies. When you think about like successful CS folks, and then you think about really successful, like high powered AEs, they actually are wired quite differently because one of them is like a pit bull, right? And then the other is really about how do I build a really great experience. I want that onboarding implementation to be flawless. I'm like really care about how it's going for them on a daily basis. These sales guys and girls are going to go, okay, I move on to the next one. And we want to build systems that enable that. Mm-hmm. Finding someone who has again, like the humility and the ability to think beyond which one they're more comfortable with, because someone's going to have a natural mode. I think is what makes this very, very tricky because you have to find someone who can think bigger, right? And then you throw marketing and then maybe revenue ops in there. Rev ops, it's like, that's all data. That's like a whole different thing. And like, a lot of especially salespeople, they like the data if it's helpful, but they don't want to spend time thinking about building huge systems that support that and measure every single moment. So I think it just, the nature of that role makes it really hard to find people that have that level of flexibility in their toolkit and the humility to recognize like, this is not my swim lane. I just need to hire excellently here, right? It is somewhat unique in that role.
So given that, when is the right time for a company to think about bringing on a chief revenue officer?
Yeah. I think we see eye to eye on this, but you need complexity for this role to make sense. And I think that complexity, in my experience in the past two companies where I've been at, as they start to really think about larger teams, your revenue is definitely not single-digit $1 million revenue levels. You're managing potentially multiple types of customer ICPs. If that is like something you're lucky enough to have and you're actually able to sell into different places, you need complexity. Like otherwise the role doesn't make sense. And I think it creates friction and it slows companies down. But at some point, and I think it depends on the type of business and like the complexity in the sell and the implementation and all of those things. But at some point, that lack of structure will actually start to slow you down and be a blocker and you'll start to drop balls, right? And so I think the very thing that made you fast, which is probably not having that role, there is a moment in time. And I think it's when you start to have aspirations for triple, like, you're going for 100 million plus, but you're somewhere south of that today. That's when you really need to start thinking about it. Cause like the ability to scale that, to manage your profitability, to think about contribution profit the right way, to think about your EBITDA as well and how that's flowing through, you can't do it without someone who's coordinating those functions. And I think personally, when you break out those functions and you have like a chief, customer officer and then pretty much a chief revenue officer that's sales and a CMO, trying to manage through all of that, like all those seats at the table, who owns that metric, right? And that goes back to the original days of my career where it's like incentives drive behaviors. And if you're going to hold someone accountable to like have to answer in a board meeting to growth, but they don't actually have all the levers at their disposal to do what they need, then you're really not giving them the ability to do that job. It's not the right metric to measure them on. You should be holding them accountable to something else. And that's where I think the CRO, if you're going to do that, it needs to be a full-throated role. Like you can't half-ass it.
I agree. And I think you're right. We are on the same page. And I do call operational complexity there's no science. I don't have it. I'd like to create maybe a bit of an analysis here, but I'd say it lands somewhere in the, 15, 20 million in revenues is when complexity becomes okay, we're a different company now. What got us here won't get us there. With there meaning like doubling ourselves to like 50 million or 100 million. You're a different business. We've all worked at companies when they reach that point. You can feel the change. All of a sudden the CEO starts talking about bureaucracies and processes that they never talked about before. Or they get a CRM system and you're being asked to do all this other stuff that we never had to do a year and a half ago. Everyone starts to feel like, oh, they're selling out. They're becoming a big company. But that's an immature response to growth. Or that's how it goes. When you get a complex organization, you have to start thinking about those things. And that's when I agree. That's when you need somebody to come in and sort of, okay, enough already. We've got our sales engine working. We obviously have a customer base out there. We have people buying our product. Fine. I would say the big lever when I know it's time for a CRO is when I see the renewal side of the business not as consistent as I'd like it to be. That probably the
Hmm.
system isn't really working best because I'm focusing too much on getting them and not keeping them.
Yep.
And my acquisition costs are probably not great because I'm too busy trying to fill a leak as opposed to focus on the real opportunity, which is expansion. And
Just to add to that, I think like another interesting signal, and I've certainly seen this at places I've worked, is you start to see a whole bunch of uncoordinated outreach and touch points with either existing clients or new clients. And I would say in worst case scenario, it's actually existing clients where you've got sales engaging, CS engaging, marketing engaging, but it is all happening with no coordination. And so it's like or the product, it's like product pings them on something, then marketing is somehow coming around the bend with like some new like effort we're doing that has not been aligned with like the sales outreach. Sales is talking to them and like, what about that thing I got, that email I got? And they're like, what are you talking about? Like when you start to see that all of a sudden there's like a disjointed aspect where you're creating friction in that user experience with your your outbound, and your touch points, like that to me is like the red flag. Cause that there's so much, like how many times does your phone ring a day with just nonsense, right? And emails, like you don't want to be part of that problem. You want to be part of the solution. And that I think again gets into coordination. And that's what this role at the end of the day ultimately is in my estimation. It's understanding how to coordinate across these functions. You can spend dollars in every single bucket. How are you using data to inform the most like valuable ROI and
Mhm.
balancing that from short-term quota attainment to to LTV, right? Like I want to drive lifetime value with these customers. And so hitting the quota this quarter may not necessarily be the right thing long term, which is sort of sacrilegious to say, right? In some circles, but I strongly believe that to be the
I
case.
agree. I do. I think you're 100% right. I think that the big constraint with bringing in a CRO is speed. These companies don't know how to slow down. They don't have it in them. They're not built that way. They're built for speed. And I think it's a mistake. I think the speed thing was a paradigm created by a combination of like investment dynamics, which is okay, if I give you this money, I want my return back at this time frame. We need to accelerate that. How can we bet more next quarter? Things that all make sense if you're running a business and someone's, I get it. Those sort of metrics don't support customer growth many times. In fact, they're the anathema to customer growth. They annoy people in the marketplace. So I think that's really pertinently true. I think there's this degree of, I think frankly, the sort of cipher, if I would call it, maybe like the Rosetta Stone or whatever I call it, for a CRO to know how to do their job is to just think about the customer from the first touch until they renew, right? So if I follow a customer throughout that process and I'm asking really detailed questions about what their relationship is with us throughout those phases, everyone should coordinate around that. And if I can make that customer experience perfect, then we should be able to then align all of our actions and motions related to that customer in a way that does that. I think Amazon did an amazing job of that over time, and they did a good job. I think you can just look at it and say, all right, so like you said, right, why is our customer now receiving two different communications? Stop that, right? That ends. So these disruptions need to be done, I think, sooner the better, so that you're not undoing a very complex problem. You're creating a more complex solution. But unfortunately, I know it happens too often when companies are already too complicated, and now it's a daunting task to undo it. But you have to. I think a CRO's job is sort of come in and sort of be the advocate for the customer across the entire organizational strain. I think that's the right way I would look at it. And I would be going to
Yes.
the customers. I'd say, tell me what it was like. How did you first hear about us? What was like? What's the thing that annoyed you the most? What changed most about when you first met us and now? Like, what promises were made that weren't kept? How did your mind change around your pre-sale to post-sale? Um,
Yeah.
all the stuff that if I can record that thing, I would say, all right, so let's. I don't want that person to ever say that again. So
Yeah.
how can we do about it? How can we take full responsibility for that customer's outcome, such that our organization changes to shape ourselves around their experience, not what we want them to do, but what their desires are. That's a
Yeah.
hard thing to do, but you got to do it. You got to do
And
it.
and I think what makes it to your point, it's just so difficult because it can be perceived as you trying to create excuses for why the thing isn't working or growing at the rate, right? If you're in a situation where like things aren't clicking. And so like people that are aspiring into that role and like emerging into that role, the ones that are probably most successful are the ones that can like honestly and with integrity articulate that, but in a way that doesn't look like, and this is why I'm not like my team's not hitting its numbers or doing its thing, or it's like, oh, well, that the product hasn't done their job or this isn't good enough. And I think that's a very challenging balance to be able to like manage in that emotion, right? Where you're like kind of in a struggle and clients are telling you it's not great, how you can translate that and bring that through that. Again, going back to the first team with like within the executive team, it's like, how do you have that conversation with you are perceived as that, right? Like you have integrity and you're going to tell them the truth in either direction. And I think, again, that gets back to having like a long-term view on how you're helping to build the value of that company, right? Like if you approach it through a pure quarterly lens, I think it becomes very hard to have that conversation credibly because people will think that you're purely motivated on like hitting your team, hitting their numbers, right? And I think, again, that short-termism can cost you dearly in the long term. And so I think that's actually one of the hardest things in that job
It
is
is.
being able to
It is.
come and say, this isn't working. How do we fix it? Right? Like what can we do collectively to fix it?
I agree. It is the hardest part. When I tell my participants in my courses, the four things sort of tout as being required for a CRO when they take the job is they need authority, autonomy, resources, and runway. They need those things. And the runway is the hardest one to get.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's really hard. Well, authority too, but you can get that. I can probably get, I can hire and fire and get budget and stuff. But time, I need more time. Like that's a fireable offense, So, how do you do that, right? I mean, you sort of have to do a lot of negotiating to get that. It's a very tricky thing. I really would like to see a world where that's not an unreasonable request. And I do think it's going to change. I just think it's going to take a lot of time. We've been in this paradigm for like 30 years of just quarterly goals and stuff. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be focusing or measuring that way. You need a framework for measurement. I got no problem with it. I'm just saying I think the top-down revenue projections that come from some board or some, that have nothing to do with reality, these things are all driven by somebody sitting somewhere that's not in the business, certainly doesn't have any relationship to the customer, that just wants things to go happen faster. It's really not that complicated. Just like, why is this going to take so damn long? Let's increase that. Ask for more. Get more out of these people. And they're not seeing the ripple effect and the constraint that it's having on the market that they're trying to serve. I mean, you and I know you probably, like me, get ridiculous amounts of inbound from people because they're all under that constraint. They have the same incentive. They want to get done things faster because that's what they're being paid to do. So they have to harass the marketplace more to get that done. And it's got nothing to do with me. I didn't. It's an arbitrary reason why I should buy something for you because you need it done this quickly. And you're making it easier for me to buy. You're making it more enticing for me to buy, but it isn't really because you're interested in my experience. And we're doing it because if you can get me to buy faster, you'll keep your job. So I'm sort of now being impacted by your false signals for your false incentives that have nothing to do with me. And over time, I think customers are like, enough already. I don't want to participate in this anymore.
Yeah.
And the winners are people that are coming in and saying, we agree with you. You shouldn't be that way. So work with us. And I think that when we started to see a shift of people moving in the direction, plus it's easier to unseat yourself from contracts now. You can move off something much faster. And it's going to even be worse. I mean, I don't see the sticky factor anymore. I think maybe companies like Salesforce, maybe, but you know what? Not so much. I can move my data elsewhere. I mean, I think we're getting rid of this idea that we can become sort of like an entrenched, utility for a company, and we can count on the fact that, the AT&T contracts, like those are gone. You can't. It doesn't work anymore. So I do think like the CRO role is poised to be this massively valuable thing. And so I guess I want to end this with this question, which is then, what's your advice? So you got like a bunch of people listening to this that are potential CROs and they're out there. What's the way that you sort of counsel them on how they should approach entering into the marketplace in this new paradigm?
Again, I think it comes down to, this is like the theme, the thread through all of this. It's like, data is an incredible language because it's objective. And in this role specifically, maybe more than any other function in a company, everyone knows whether you're the job, whether it's working or not, right? It's a very binary, like the numbers are either being hit or they are not. And so you spend a tremendous amount of your time digging into and having to articulate the why, whether it's going really well or going really poorly. You're spending a lot of time talking about this is going great, do more, you can do more, or like this is doing terribly, you need to speed up, right? But it's never like just keep doing what you're doing, like we are in a great spot. And so navigating those conversations, because again, once you're in the C-suite, the amount you're doing versus how much you're directing and setting the tone and setting the system and setting the goals, like you're not the one doing the sales probably, but you are certainly responsible for setting up the appropriate structures, hiring the appropriate people, incentivizing the appropriate way. You have to figure out how you're navigating CS and sales and how they integrate together and how they are actually mutually aligned. So sales isn't selling stuff CS can't execute on, and all of that. This is so much easier when you are able to structure and think about the data that you're going to need to talk about why it's working, and then being willing to just be open and honest about like the hypothesis was X. It did not work. Here's what we know. Based off of this information, we're going to do this differently. Or the hypothesis is X. It is on fire. This is great. We're actually going to I need more. Hey, CFO, I need more money because I'm going to put it here and it's going to get you this return. I think the people that I see struggle in these roles and as they get more senior in companies in general is they believe that like the thing that got them there, which is like they're great at building relationships. It's a lot of individual, I can do this thing. That doesn't work once you have to explain what's going on in a broad organization, especially if those organizations are, again, somewhat disparate. And so you have to be able to think through the lens of data. And I think that's maybe the biggest shift. Like when you go from, not to say that pure play sales leaders aren't data driven, because I think that's some of the most data driven organizations. Agreed. But usually those folks are supported by like really strong finance organizations or like a good RevOps org. And whether that lives within the office of the CRO or not, I think it should, but you see it in different ways. But it's not necessarily their first language. It's like a forced language that they have to learn, and they'd rather be talking to customers, right? And I think the getting comfortable living in that information and being able to use that to say, this is the strategy, it's working or it's not, and being completely open and honest about that. That's how you build like longevity in that role, because people know there's going to be ups and downs. Markets are going to change. Elections are going to happen. Like things will just happen in the world. Yep. It's not about how you're doing today. It's like, will this person get us through this phase and the next phase and the next phase, knowing it's going to be different? And I think that's very hard to do if you don't have that paradigm and that structure around what you're running, right? Because you're running a multidisciplinary large organization that's doing a bunch of different things, but ultimately is responsible for the outcomes of that company. Like the success and failure lives and dies there, right? So
yeah, agreed.
Long answer, but it's one I'm quite passionate about.
Right. So. No, I get it. And I agree. I agree with all of it. I think you have to do your due diligence. You have to know the right questions to ask, and you have to be willing to like listen to the answers and make the right, not try and sort of like retranslate the answers to the way you want to hear them. You have to kind of listen to what you're really dealing with and make the right decision. I see a lot of people feeling like victims. I was like, well, they told you that they wanted you to run sales. What are you complaining about? You said yes.
Right.
So, you made the bed, sleep in it. Well, look, this was great. And as I suspected, I mean, it's great to hear someone who like articulates this issue almost identically to me. And it's great. I love it. It's really refreshing. So, I appreciate your time. And, I guess you're now going to be sort of like on the circuit, kind of like doing a little bit more consulting work. How can people reach out to you? How can they find you?
Yeah, I am going to be building all of that stuff right now, so it's very new for me. But you can find me on LinkedIn. If everyone wants to reach out, you can search my name right there, and I'm always happy to connect with folks. So LinkedIn is definitely the best way to reach out to me today.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation and your insights, and I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Warren. Appreciate it. Great chat.
Thanks for listening to the CRO Insights podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.